They fought together against their common enemy. Despite their differences, despite their suspicions. Together. We need to do the same if we're gonna survive. Because the enemy is real. It's always been real.
Rooted at profound depths, there's almost no uniformly unchallenged topic pertaining to cannabis, and the labyrinthian chasms to explore are endless. When two or more strong-willed parties meet, rarely do they pass up a heated debate and find broad consensus. How could they? Cannabis's historical milieu has mostly been played out in the shadows. But there are two things we can say with relative veracity. The first is, when it comes to farm-scale cultivation and decriminalization-focused legislation, the western states of the United States of America have always been a step or two or three ahead of the eastern states. The second, corporate cannabis is bad. Very, very bad. Let's start west. Decades before the dominoes of state-by-state decriminalization began to fall, the rogue farmers of the Emerald Triangle in California were mining their craft in relative anonymity, pumping out most of the country's black market cannabis. Buoyed by the ability to operate with less legal pressure from the local municipalities, California had a unique and advantageous freedom to cultivate. The remaining Western Front states of Washington and Oregon,
the first state to decriminalize small amounts of cannabis in 1973,
have their own histories of growing and legislating cannabis. And while it's not the West Coast per se, in 2012, Colorado boldly paved the way for every other state in the country by being the first to legalize and implement an adult use market. The governing bodies on the eastern side, my side of the country, have stayed true to our collectively tight, puritanic, and less than tolerant history. No state east of Colorado rolled out a retail-style adult use program until Massachusetts did so in 2018. And while it may still take months to see physical storefronts in New Jersey, they are coming, and that is the next huge East Coast domino to fall. Considering its large population and geographic status as the Peppers and Mutts sandwiched between Philly and New York, the New Jersey adult use market will have a giant spotlight by the time they get it together. That basically covers the entirety of the legal rec markets for the East Coast. But not completely. A remote domino in the most northeastern pocket of the country fell with relative silence when it recently rolled out its adult use program in October of 2020. And for years before that, this state's medical program has been the apple of East Coast cannabis enthusiasts' eyes. For one reason or another, Maine never received a customary push from the national press when it opened its first adult-use retail cannabis shops. This was primarily due to the ongoing COVID-19 travel restrictions and its remote location in the weather-challenged corner of my beloved Northeast. Maine's rollout has been the nation's quietest in recent memory. And while COVID and location are obviously low-hanging excuses, they obscure the confrontational nature of what's been really going on in Maine between the adult use market and the medical market. The adult use market in Maine boasts some truly great flower cultivators: Gela, Maine Cannabis Exchange, etc. But unfortunately, it also features other poorly thought out staples of the East Coast model. Price gouging with a hefty tax on top, plant tracking and tracing reports, increased startup costs, overly restrictive and wasteful packaging, and last but not least, tedious testing requirements that demand shuffling product back and forth, ultimately diminishing the freshness of newly cut flower. The adult use and medical markets in several states possess many of the same characteristics, which unfortunately makes legal cultivation untenable for craft cannabis producers and enthusiasts. But perhaps the reason Maine's adult use market hasn't been met with so much fanfare is because the way Maine's medical market operates has made it the real game in New England and beyond. The medical market in Maine is like the major leagues, where every other eastern state's adult use and medical markets are like AAA, unrecognizable to any other medical cannabis market in the country. They're playing on a completely different and elevated field. And the country's medical patients, particularly New Englanders, get to bask in the glorious spoils of it all. If you have a medical card from almost any state and a matching license, crossing over Maine's border is akin to the doors parting at Willy Wonka's weed factory. And people should be aware of what medical patients in and around the states have known for years. In a country ravaged by the contagion of corporate, medical, and adult use products, Maine is a gorgeous valley of shiny trichomes at the end of hundreds of miles of predominantly dried out, leafy hay bale swag. Maine is the best state for legal cannabis on the East Coast right now, and frankly, there's not even a close second. Why is Maine the premier East Coast spot for cannabis on the medical side? It comes down to two reasons. Cultivators and extractors know what they're doing, and much more importantly, due to Maine's equitable caregiver model of licensing, they're allowed to do it peacefully with limited overhead. The low cost of entry into the Maine medical market means that even though it's under the medical market umbrella, the caregiver infrastructure provides the most small business friendly model for manufacturing and distributing cannabis in the country. With caregiver applications starting at $240, people, not corporations, are given a far more equitable playing field in cannabis than in almost every other state in the country. As citizens whose passions for cannabis burn brightly, even under prohibitive circumstances, caregivers can produce and provide to the market lawfully without the bottom line fees that have broken the backs of small cannabis farmers attempting to transition to the legal market but have been forced to stay underground. Not only are medical patients able to purchase these craft products from the state's countless medical storefronts, but caregivers can also even sell to patients directly. In a farm-to-table obsessed country, how does it get better than that? No large-scale grow rooms bogged down in pests or mold, no long testing processes for a perishable plant to endure, no drying out while gathering a film of dust on back inventory shelves, etc. Straight to the source, so fresh, so clean. In a cannabis regulation-heavy country, how is Maine's caregiver-centered medical market allowed to operate in a neighborly fashion without the scarlet letter in the form of governmental overreach in adult-use markets? It really comes down to several amendments passed in recent years which repealed the existing 2009 Maine medical laws, stripping them of restrictive language and providing additional language which allows for a broader scope of cultivation, possession, and sales, all of which ultimately opens the door for a far more free market approach. It should be noted that as I say this, the current consumer-friendly medical system Maine's adopted is in complete flux, as the state's OMP, the Office of Marijuana Policy, has recently proposed laws that would upend Maine's caregiver-based medical market and bring it more in line with the state's adult use laws, which boast the aforementioned raised fee structures and more rigorous, lengthy testing processes. State governors are obsessed with making sure weed is safe, but they don't apply the same measures to farmers market style products, which include meat and wine. Why? More people have died from E. coli and cirrhosis than weed. But for some reason, state governments are worried people will develop psychosis from some dank ass bud. The worst thing that can happen to you on weed will be a panic attack, and it's not fun. I know from personal experience, but it goes away, and relatively quickly compared to all other intoxicants, legal or not. The med market in Maine allows for more freedom in cultivation, transfer, packaging, and sales. The enforcement of these restrictive and big money friendly styles of legislation, whether intentional or not, would ultimately squeeze out Maine's unique mom and pop style cannabis shops and growers. Unfortunately, this attempt to stifle creativity by rendering plants into regulated data units is symptomatic of the United States' inability to break free of the chains of cannabis stigmatization. By forcing cultivators to jump through demoralizing hula hoops, the U.S. government is not only feeding into its reputation for corporate socialism, but all the testing requirements and packaging requirements indirectly treats cannabis as a potential existential threat that deserves more regulation than alcohol and several other potentially dangerous prescription drugs. People have sometimes told me that I do too many good reviews and not enough bad reviews. And that's for two reasons. The first is because I wanted Cloudland to be a positive show that embraces the most beautiful plant ever. And the second reason is because Maine. If there was no Maine, there'd probably be no Cloudland. Or Cloudland would just be a lot of shitty reviews and end with me being bummed out because I just spent $60 on 3.5 grams, which won't even get me fucking high. But Maine's a craft cannabis wonderland, and I'm a med patient in the United States, which means I literally don't ever have to smoke another bad bud in my life. Unless the OMP fucks it all up. This unique yet completely sensical system is being threatened. But for now, the creative floodgates of Maine's medical market remain open to grateful arms, and the weed, the dabs, the edibles are in another stratosphere than the rest of the mostly arid East Coast dispensary scene. If you find yourself in Maine and have your medical card, support these places. Kind Farms Reserve, Sinsemilla, Black Tie, Paul's Boutique, Jarco, Origins Cannabis. I could go on and on and on. These are the places that make Maine cannabis what it is. Avoid corporate cannabis at all costs. Theory Wellness, Curaleaf, MedMen, Acreage Holdings, Cresco. Do not support these places. These are owned by opportunists who don't give a fuck about whatever state they're raiding, and they would sell you ground up pencil shavings as keef for your last $25 before they consider embracing the concept of ethics. We deserve better as consumers in this country. The way legal cannabis has been implemented is a microcosm of the structural inequities that plague our nation as a whole. Call your congresspeople, talk to your town reps, see where they stand on these issues, and weigh your decisions accordingly. Also, if you benefit from Maine's caregiver system, consider donating to the Maine Cannabis Coalition Lobbyist Fund. Corporate cannabis has deep pockets, therefore we need to counter with our own sense of advocacy. Someday I'd like legislation that allows the whole country to develop small cannabis businesses. But for now, this is the best thing we've got going. Keep the medical market in Maine a place where people are cared for, not rounded up like cattle at the DMV, then ration pre-rolls sold by underpaid bud tenders made from weed grown by underpaid and overworked cultivators. It's all so unsavory to me, like a breadline that charges $10 for a shitty loaf. Wherever you live, do whatever you can to support smaller cannabis companies. These are essential businesses run by people who actually give a damn about the plant, their employees, and their communities. I appreciate you guys for staying until the end of this rant, and I thank you for joining me on an episode of Cloudland that's super important to maintaining a pocket of integrity on the legal East Coast cannabis scene. Thank you all again, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.